welcome to a brand new mini-series from the lovely people at History Hack. I'm Charlotte White, but you can call me Charly, and this is MsUnderstood. I'm going to be joined by a stellar lineup of guests who are each going to help me explore the lives of women who've been dealt an unfair hand by history. They may not all be great women who changed the world. They may not all be good women, but they will all be interesting. Some have been forgotten, some ignored, and some misrepresented, but they've all been misunderstood. Now, before we kick off this episode, I do just have to remind you that we are trading on Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/historyhack, you can support the work that we do here. We've got loads of rewards for you, ranging from, just a little hello from the wonderful Chris Sams, all the way up to, I think, an actual date with Chris Sams. We're giving out boaty nerds, people. If that's perhaps stretching your budget a little bit, you can just buy us a coffee. So we're on ko-fi.com, which is ko-fi.com/historyhack, where you can just give us a tip. If you enjoy an episode, drop us a couple of quid, say thanks. It helps us keep going. We are an indie. We're nice and scrappy in that way. So thank you for your support. Tell anybody you can about the podcast. Let's see if you enjoy this one. And before we do get started, I should tell you that we have had some slight problems with the audio on this episode. We didn't want to bin it because it's a fantastic chat. This was recorded back in April after I'd read the fantastic proof of this book, and we were really excited and wanted to get recording, obviously. But we'd recently switched to the new platform that we're using, so we had a few teething problems. Stick with us, listen up, I promise you will not regret it. Annie Garthwaite's debut novel, Cecily, told the story of Cecily Neville, wife of a murdered royal claimant, mother to 2 kings of England, now given her own voice. We had Annie on at the time, and you can listen back to that episode. I'm sure we'll pop some links in the episode for you. Today, Annie's back to discuss her second novel, which brings us back into Cecily's world as the Wars of the Roses reach their bloody height. The King's Mother is a historical novel so affecting that it made me cry. Full-on ugly cry. And then it did the same to my Ricardian mother, and I'm guessing she's a blonde as well. We are not looking good when we cry, so that was probably an ugly cry too, Mum. How we wish that familiar story had ended differently. But that's the War of the Roses for you. Let's talk to the lady who's responsible for upsetting us all. Hello, Annie.
Hello. I'm sorry, not sorry that I made you cry.
Again, I'm kind of furious with you because as a historical novelist, you could have changed the ending, couldn't you?
The temptation to do that is huge, but I'm a bit sort of Star Trek about historical facts and don't mess with the timeline, So yeah, it had to be true. But I tell you, it was agony for me. I cried many times writing this book, particularly some of those final chapters.
Of course.
And the grief, I guess, feels very, you know that these people died 500 and more years ago, but it feels when you're writing them that their death is today. It's very sad.
They're people that you do very much live with, and when you've got history this incredible, you don't need to change it. You don't need to mess around with it.
Yeah.
It all sounds completely made up, even without being there. So without wishing to cover old ground, because we have talked about Cecily, who was she, and where do we find her in the opening scenes of The King's Mother?
Okay, so in the opening scenes of The King's Mother, she is kind of at the height of her power in so many ways. We know that Cecily was the matriarch of the House of York. She was mother to Edward IV and Richard III. And as this book opens, she is at the zenith. She has secured that title of King's Mother because she has put her boy Edward on the throne. And it's been a completely tumultuous year for her because although, as this book opens, she is in triumph, she has lost her husband and another of her sons in battle on the way to this achievement. So it's by no means cheerful, let's say, but it's a huge sort of relief and it's a huge achievement. And she becomes King's mother. Edward, as the book opens, is still in the north of England fighting yet another army. So there is still unfinished business going on. And she has the not enviable task of holding London on his behalf.
Wow.
Because he has gone off to fight another battle and he has left her in charge of his kingdom.
What a formidable woman.
What a formidable woman. There's a wonderful letter from one of the ambassadors back to who is stationed in London, writing back to his masters in Europe, trying to explain what's happening in England. And the letter more or less says, yes, here's what's happening in England, and it looks like it is regime change, and it looks like Edward is going to be king, and that's great because the people love him like a god. But if we want to do business in England, we need to do it with his mother. Because she rules the king as she will. So, she was absolutely there with her hands on the reins and keeping all of those plates spinning and those balls in the air.
And I'm sort of thinking about every way that we've been taught history throughout our lives. She couldn't possibly have been important. She was just a woman. But this time seems to be filled with incredibly formidable women.
Yes, and that's been the great joy of writing this second book, actually, because the first book, Cecily, was very much about Cecily and her power. This book gives us three other women who, through the course of the story, are going to contend with Cecily for the role as King's mother, because they all want to put their boy on the throne. And they are, three more immensely powerful women. We've got Marguerite of Anjou, who we met in The King's Mother. She's in Cecily, and she's still around. She's down, but definitely not out, and she is still fighting for her son, and she's coming back. We have Elizabeth Woodville, who becomes Edward IV's wife and queen, so Cecily's own daughter-in-law. And that is a very fraught relationship between she and Cecily. And she had, poor Elizabeth certainly has cause to wish for revenge as things turn out. And she attempts to usurp the throne from Cecily's second royal son, Richard III. And then, of course, we have Margaret Beaufort, becomes the mother of the Tudor dynasty. So we kind of know how that ends. And through the book, Cecily and Margaret have a long friendship, which is eventually betrayed. But, these women, historians even now struggle to make sense of what happened during the Wars of the Roses and who was doing what, when, and why, and to who. And I tell you one thing, when you look at what the women were doing and what their motivations were, the whole thing makes a lot more sense. Because this wasn't just a series of wars that women endured or survived or fell prey to. This was a series of wars that these women engineered and brought about.
It's incredible. The more I learn about these women, the more I want to know of them. And you start to see that it's not just soft power. It's real intervention and drive and ambition.
Yes.
And I'm not going to spoiler any of this for our listeners, because even though the history, fair play, we can't spoiler it because you could Wikipedia that, but your reading of these women is so innovative, and you've written relationships in ways that I've not considered before. But the relationship between those four women is
Yes, and
incredible.
that's the other thing. If you read if you read the historians, you kind of get the impression that these four women didn't really know each other and didn't have much to do with each other and almost never met. But they were intimate. They were really, really close. If you think of Elizabeth Woodville, for example, who, suddenly pops up married to Edward IV. But she's no stranger to Cecily when that happens. Her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, was with Cecily in France when their husbands were both stationed there. Jacquetta was there when Edward IV was born in France, and you can almost imagine a 5-year-old Elizabeth Woodville peering into Edward IV's crib to see him. So these women were intimate, and they were all, of course, mothers of sons. And on the blurb on the back of this book, it says, this is a tale of maternal ferocity and female ambition. And it kind of is, because these women will do pretty much anything for their sons. And sometimes you think, are they doing it to keep their sons alive, or are they doing it to make them kings? Is it about ambition, or is it about survival? And the truth is, it's both, isn't it? It's inevitably both. But I found the relationship between the four of them, and particularly, I suppose, between Cecily and Margaret, wonderful to write.
Feel your enjoyment. Right, we'll get us away from me wanting to spoil things for people. And this idea of the king's mother, this I really love, because it's quite new with Cecily Neville, isn't it? How did her role change once Edward is on the throne, and what's her relationship like with her golden son of York?
Her golden boy, yeah. Well, throughout her life, Cecily has been a powerful noblewoman. She has been Duchess of York. But suddenly, when Edward comes to the throne, she is the mother of the king. And she decides to be rather more than that, and gives herself the formal title, in a way that women really hadn't before, of My Lady the King's Mother. And it's very evident that Edward leaned on her heavily, particularly in those early years of his reign. And when you think about it, it's not really that surprising. Edward, as the novel opens and as he becomes king, is 18 years old. He's very young. He didn't really expect ever to be king. He's blonde and beautiful and 6'4" tall, and he's won every battle he's ever fought. He's great with a sword, but he's not great at much else, And his mother is already a seasoned politician, a seasoned mover and shaker with years of experience under her belt. So, and she is also the person that he can, in a kingdom that is still very divided, that he can trust implicitly to have his best interests at heart. So in that sense, it's hardly surprising that he leans very heavily upon her. And he does. And even, I think, did that change after he married Elizabeth Woodville? Well, a bit, because suddenly she was the first lady of the kingdom and Cecily was not. But my impression is still, even after that, it was Cecily that Edward went to when he needed to talk over difficult conundrums and find solutions. And she certainly wielded an enormous amount of power.
This is though one thing that Edward didn't consult his mother on, isn't it? His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. It's a moment that I was so looking forward to. If I could have been in that room when he told her, I think it would have been quite amusing. So how do you think Cecily felt about Edward marrying Elizabeth Woodville? Because for context, she is, in air quotes, a commoner. This marriage is not necessarily the one that Cecily would have liked.
It's definitely not the marriage that she would have chosen, and I don't think it's the marriage that anyone in the kingdom whose name wasn't Woodville would have chosen. um, Elizabeth Woodville was a widow. She was a Lancastrian widow, so her husband had died fighting on the other side. She was minor nobility. Her father was a knight. Her mother was quite grand, but her father certainly wasn't. And Edward was expected to make a powerful match that would bring him both prestige in Europe and money, which he desperately needed because the treasury was pretty much empty after so many years of war, and Henry VI had left the kingdom in a financial muddle. And Cecily had been actively looking ahead towards probably a French marriage that would bring a treaty with it, and hopefully some French land, and so on and so forth. And of course, Edward's cousin, the Earl of Warwick, had been out negotiating with the French to make that very marriage, when Edward had to come clean and confess that actually he'd already been and done it. And I can imagine Cecily being utterly furious for two reasons. First of all, because he'd married Elizabeth Woodville of all people. And secondly, because my impression of Cecily is that there is one thing that she cannot bear, and that's not being in control. So suddenly he had done something without her agreement, without her counsel, that he must have known would have been very much against her wishes. And she must have been furious. But Cecily is ever the pragmatist, I think, and once the deal was done, and once the marriage was made, she clearly buckled down and got on with it and accepted it. And there's evidence that she helped Elizabeth, because Elizabeth too would not have been a girl prepared for queenship.
Yeah.
You know, she lent her servants who would help her, prepare herself and fit into this new role. And she was there in a supporting role. She never spoke publicly against Elizabeth. She kind of bit her tongue, and she supported Elizabeth absolutely. And that can't have been easy. And it's only much later in the novel when things have clearly broken down between, there are other members of Cecily's family who are less accommodating to Elizabeth than Cecily was. And it's only after all of those events that Elizabeth becomes so poisoned against Cecily's family that the whole thing sort of falls apart.
Amazing. So she was that much of a politician that she could have a decent relationship, really, with her daughter-in-law.
Yeah.
Amazing.
She was she was such a politician. She could have seasoned relations, have good relationships with with all of her enemies, of which she had many, including Henry Tudor in the end.
So we touched on the Earl of Warwick, who is such a wonderfully kind of malignant force in so many ways throughout this novel. So this story, it involves Cecily navigating some really complicated struggles within her own family. Because am I right that Warwick is her nephew?
Yes.
So they didn't call it the Cousins' War for nothing, right?
Absolutely. This is the biggest family quarrel you'll ever come across in history. Yeah. It's brother turning against brother and cousin against cousin.
So how did she manage these people? Could she play all sides? Did she have to pick a side, or how do you work this kind of thing?
I think for quite some time she helped to keep the peace between Edward and Warwick. And, my sense with the two of them, with Edward and Warwick, that this was a bit of a bromance gone wrong. Warwick was a bit older than Edward. Edward had always hero worshipped him a bit. They had fought together. They'd been through adversity together. And I think, they were close. They were close. And I think Warwick expected to have a much greater influence on Edward's kingship than in the end Edward was prepared to give. And Warwick, rightly or wrongly, centered his resentment of that on Elizabeth Woodville and blamed this marriage. He was cut because he was embarrassed before the King of France, with whom he'd negotiated a great marriage for Edward. He had to go back and say, well, I'm sorry, my king's married somebody else. That must have been massively humiliating. So that's where the rot set in, I think. And then it just got worse. He watched Woodvilles being given lands and titles that he might have seen coming his way. But I think at the bottom of it, he just couldn't bear that Edward loved someone else so much more than he loved him.
Yeah.
And I think that's the tragedy of their relationship. And eventually, even Cecily can't paper over the cracks of the way that those two men finally treat each other.
Mm.
And Warwick becomes the biggest traitor. And of course, draws Cecily's younger son, George, into treachery with him.
This is, I mean, if you're taking the sort of idea of it being a bromance, this is classic spurned lover behaviour, isn't it? Because Warwick can't control Edward, and they've got a problem going on there. So he goes off with his younger brother, George. Now, George is often, I think maybe people know of Edward IV, they know of Richard III, who are both sons of Cecily. But perhaps if they don't know the Wars of the Roses, they might not know that there was a third brother or a second spare,
Yeah.
as we could call George. What was he like?
Well, in the pecking order, so we have Edward, then George, then Richard.
Mm.
So in the early years of Edward's reign, before he had children, before he married Elizabeth, before they then had children, George was the obvious heir to Edward's kingship. And that can be a very uneasy relationship. And that relationship becomes even more uneasy once he's been supplanted as heir by the birth of a child. And, you know, we don't have to look very far. We're seeing it work out in our own society right now, aren't we? Where we have William and we have Harry, the spare,
Yeah.
who just, you know, that sort of sibling resentment, that difficulty of being not the number one son, not the guy who gets to sit on the throne, not the golden boy who's 6'4" and everybody loves him and obeys his every word, you know, the other guy.
Mm.
And that's a very painful place to be, I think. For Richard, because he was the third son, you know, perhaps he would not have felt that quite so sorely as George did. So there's all of that going on, but then there's just George's absolutely abysmal temperament. Because he is jealous and he is small-minded and he is vicious. I mean, there was sometimes when I was writing him, I thought, I'm not quite sure he's entirely in his right mind.
Mm.
And I think Cecily sometimes felt that too. And that must have been very terrible and very bitter for Cecily, I think, to see her two sons so at odds.
Yeah.
And when you think of, you know, Warwick was her nephew. He was her favourite brother's son.
And then to complicate matters still further, Warwick marries his daughter to George.
Yes. That's another marriage that gets made without Cecily's permission.
And without Edward's permission as well, I seem to recall.
Absolutely without Edward's permission. Because Warwick finds himself in a bit of a bind because Elizabeth Woodville has a lot of brothers and sisters, all of whom have to be, when she becomes queen, suddenly aggrandized. So there's a whole series of stellar marriages made for Elizabeth's siblings. And I can imagine Warwick sitting there and thinking, well, I've got two daughters. Who the hell are they going to marry?
Yeah.
You know, and looking around and everyone's been snapped up by the Woodvilles. The only two available candidates are Edward's two younger brothers, George and Richard. And Warwick's thinking, I'm Edward's big chum. Surely he'd let me marry my daughters to his brothers. And of course, Edward wouldn't dream of doing such a thing. So Warwick does it clandestinely.
It's wonderful that he does very much get his own way in the end with Isabel marrying George and then Anne Neville marrying Richard and eventually becoming Queen of England, though I don't think Warwick's around to really celebrate that, is he?
No, he's long gone by the time Anne becomes queen. Yeah.
Honestly, there's guys, this is real history that Annie is writing here. But if I was to tell you that she was a screenwriter for Hollyoaks, you wouldn't disbelieve me, would you?
I remember when I was writing this book, and my editor asked me to send a synopsis over of the, just what happens in the book. And I sent the synopsis over, and 10 minutes later, she rang me back and she said, "Really? All of that?" Yeah, I'm afraid so. And then he did this and she did that. Yeah,
Yeah.
really. I mean, sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And that's what's so utterly fascinating about this period of history. It is like soap opera. It's so dramatic and it's so personality driven. You've just got all of these characters with immense personalities, very strong wills, fueled often by greed and envy and ambition, who don't see and won't accept any restrictions on their behavior. So they just get on with it.
Do we have anything left of Cecily? I mean, do we have letters or anything of her that you could sort of draw upon when you're telling her story, but it's not, not the history that we all know and love, when it's her story? Did you have anything that you could go to?
There are lots of letters, many letters, but to be honest, they're fairly circumspect letters. They're business correspondence for the most part, and they don't give an awful lot away about her personality. And I think that one of the ways that Cecily survived through all of this turmoil was by playing her cards very close to her chest, by not revealing herself to many people. So there's very little that really tells you what she's really thinking at any one of these moments. And you have to read that through her action and through other people's responses to her. One of the most fascinating documents that has survived is her will. And I think I'm right in saying that it's the most extensive and complete will that we have of a medieval woman.
Wow.
And it's fascinating to see who, at the end of her life, which is 10 years into the Tudor dynasty, who she is bequeathing gifts to, and through doing that, whose favour she is seeking to secure. Because in the final years of her life, her concerns were very much with protecting those members of her family that survived, and protecting her retainers and her household, if you like. And she gave gifts to Margaret Beaufort. She left gifts in her will to Margaret and to Henry. And those are very revealing, what she left. But by then, all but 2 of her children were dead.
Yeah. She didn't have a lot of people left to leave stuff to, and she'd had a lot of children, hadn't she? Not just the 3 sons of York that we think of. There were many more.
Yeah, she had 13 children. 7 of them survived into adulthood, and only 2 of them, 2 daughters, survived her. And I guess there's 2 things going on in this book, really. There's Cecily and her relationship with these 3 other women. And then there's Cecily and her relationship with her boys, with these troublesome children. And that was wonderful to engage in and to write, about how a woman feels differently for each of these 3 boys. Edward is he's not quite her firstborn. She did have a son before him who died shortly after being born. But, he's her oldest, he's her golden boy. I mean, he's so hot she can barely touch him without burning, And then there's George, whose life she has struggled to preserve and yet is so difficult to love, And then, of course, there's Richard, and it is reported that he, of all her children, was the most like their father, most like Cecily's husband. And I drew upon that a lot when I came to write him, because there are moments in the book where Cecily can hardly bear to look at him because he reminds her so much of her dead husband. And the journey of their relationship through the book is how that reminder is, in the beginning, very painful, but by the end, her only comfort, when he is the last of her sons left. and she realizes the extent and the depth of her love for him. But I thought I might read you a little bit
Oh, I'd love that.
about Cecily and her sons. A scene from the book. It's just before a major battle, which is called the Battle of Barnet, and Barnet is about 10 miles out of London, and it was one of the conclusive battles of the Wars of the Roses. And rarely enough, it was pretty much the only time when Cecily's three sons fought together on the same side against the common enemy rather than against each other. And so she has seen her boys go off. She knows they've got this terrible battle ahead of them. She is in the tower waiting to hear what happens. A messenger comes at midnight to say that Edward has drawn up his battle lines north of Barnet, 10 miles from the city. Another sleepless night. At last, she gives up waiting for the dawn to light her window and goes to seek it out on the walls. The stones are coldly wet against her hand, and the walkway between lonely guard posts pooled in torchlight is treacherously shadowed. She looks east and waits again, until at last a thin smudge of milky whiteness marks the distant horizon. Nothing like morning yet, but the promise of it. Now she knows the camp will be rousing, her sons rising from camp beds by lamplight, making confession, breaking their fast. Her husband once admitted he could never eat before battle, nor drink much for fear of pissing himself. She wonders what it's like to feel such fear in the body, to master it and fight. They'll be calling their squires to arm them now. They'll stand, chin up, legs wide, the pinions of their arms lifted so that naked flesh can be wrapped in leather, encased in steel, their vulnerable flesh hidden, their pulsing veins buried deep. Still, the sky doesn't lighten. The day seems weighted and the air thick and cold, but she hears the tolling of the bell that marks the hour and knows that even now they'll be stepping from their tents onto the dew-soaked grass, visors raised to scent the air. They'll test the slide of swords from scabbards, the hang of daggers at the hip. Their captains will come up for final orders, signed off with a dry-mouthed prayer. The darkness fades to grey, but no sun comes. A mist lies thick upon the river, so that even the wharves of the opposite bank are lost to sight. She blinks, and beads of moisture fall from her lashes. She touches her face and brings her hand away wet. Now they'll be mounting to ride to their command positions. She hopes they'll embrace before they go. She strains her eyes and wonders where the fog rolls over the battleground, whether death will come for them unseen. She feels the restless shift of horses at the early cannon's volley, the windy rush of the first arrow's flight. Her heart hammers as the charge begins, as limbs stretch in the gallop and swords lift in a swing. Not 10 miles from where she stands. She could find a horse and be there within the hour. She's down the steps already, walking fast to the chapel, where the air hangs heavy with incense and the women wrestle in prayer.
Doesn't that just sum up the lot of women in this kind of time? She could be the greatest politician, she could be the most important woman in the country, yet when it comes to that moment, all she can do is wait.
Yeah, and she's a mother
Yeah.
who has to send her sons into battle. And, you know, the way our world is at the moment, there are an awful lot of mothers having to do that. Yeah.
far too many. I do love that idea of if she could get a horse,
Yes,
if she could, yeah, her kingdom for a horse, she'd be there, wouldn't she, by their
yes,
sides?
because she's that sort of woman, isn't she? She can't bear not to be in the action,
Yeah,
but on the battlefield, of course, she can't be.
yeah. The thought of anybody hurting her sons, this isn't a little scrap. This is playing for very big stakes. Absolutely incredible. Gosh, I'm thinking now about when you talk about how she is with Richard, and I do find that amazing because fans of Shakespeare will remember her as being absolutely appalled and disgusted by him
Mm.
at all times.
Yes.
As he comes into kingship, how do you think she felt about him at that time? Kind of 1483.
1483.
Mm,
Yeah, what a tumultuous time. By then, of course, he is her only remaining son,
mm,
and he is very much at risk because Elizabeth Woodville has launched a coup against him in order to protect her own children, and they are the Woodvilles and Richard are bitter enemies, and there's no question that Elizabeth is attempting to secure the throne for her boys, and that would probably cost Richard his life.
yeah.
And at that point, I guess, Cecily realizes the depth of her love for Richard and also her ambition for her dynasty, because she simply can't stand by and let that happen.
Mm,
So when you look at the history, there's no question in my mind that Cecily was behind and was supportive of Richard III's bid for the throne.
mm,
In that crucial few months in the summer of 1483, after Edward had died, Richard had brought the new king to London. The Woodvilles had attempted a coup. Richard is trying to work out what on earth it is he's going to do, how he's going to bring his nephew safely to his kingship.
mm.
And then afterwards, when he decides that he is going to aim for the kingship himself, he bases his headquarters, in Cecily's townhouse in London, in Baynard's Castle. So it seems clear to me that she's in the thick of his
Mm.
policy. And you'll see how that works out when you read the book. No spoilers.
Yeah,
Um, but
definitely not spoiling that.
yeah, I mean, the way, and I'm a novelist, and we can't deduce all of this from history. But my sense with Richard is that he was the last of her children to survive. She had one more daughter after him who died as a child, as a baby. So he was the last of her children to survive. He was born at a terrible time for her and for their family, when they were under a great deal of pressure and difficulty. We know that she was ill around the time that he was born. You can imagine, post-birth difficulties and so on and so forth. He was the third son. He wasn't the golden boy, Edward. So you can imagine there being not so much closeness between them. And then this likeness to his father, always the troublesome reminder of what she'd lost. But in the end, he is all she has.
Amazing. It's a wonderful way of unlocking this conundrum of 1483 that still divides people. Everyone is very, very divided over, because Edward dies so suddenly, and
Yes.
the boy, his son, his eldest son, is not old enough to reign on his own. And then you've got Richard. Is he the usurper? Is he the rightful heir? How does that all play out? But actually, when you start looking at it through the lens of the women, and you look at how they behaved and what they did, it all starts to become just perhaps a little bit more clear. Maybe we've been
Yes.
missing half the story for a very
Yeah.
long time.
That we've been missing half the story for a long time. And it's a problem with a male-focused history that we've had for so long. I was at a history event a few months ago now, when I was still writing this book, so it's a little while ago. And there was a very eminent male historian of this period And I was interested to know what his view of Margaret Beaufort would be. So I asked him, and he looked at me as if I'd just arrived from Planet Zorg and said, I've never given the woman a moment's thought. But she's the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty.
Oh my God.
And when you think about it, did Henry VII beat Richard III on the battlefield? Yes, he did. But Henry VII would never have made it to the battlefield were it not for his mother's actions before, in preparation for that, for her manoeuvrings and machinations that brought about his invasion of England.
Mm.
He'd never even have got to Bosworth. So was it Henry VII that brought down Richard III, or was it Margaret Beaufort who brought down Cecily Neville?
That's just, when they ask that question, how many times a day do you think about the Roman Empire? It really should be, how many times a day do you think about Margaret Beaufort? Because I tell you, she lives in my head rent-free.
Yeah,
Quite a lot.
absolutely. And she and Cecily are so alike. So alike. And you see when Margaret eventually becomes king's mother, when Henry VII comes to the throne, Margaret completely models her behaviour in that role on Cecily's. It's on, and you remember she was a much younger woman, so it feels to me very much like she studied Cecily's game all through her life. And when the moment came, she stepped into her shoes very easily. They were equally determined, they were equally intelligent, they were equally political, and they were equally, utterly devoted to their boys. And that makes for a very dangerous clash when it comes.
So when we look at the fate of these women, so Margaret Beaufort ends up being the king's mother, then later the king's grandmother. Does she style herself after that when Henry VIII comes to the throne?
Yes, she dies when she dies 2 months after Henry VII dies. So she does see her golden boy die. And weeks after she's witnessed the coronation of Henry VIII, which she helped to organise. She stayed very politically active right up to the end. So she died in 1509. She was the longest living of the four, longest lasting of the four women. So she saw her dynasty secure to that point.
Yeah. How about Margaret of Anjou and Elizabeth Woodville? How do they end up?
Marguerite. Yeah, sorry, my fault. You have to feel for Marguerite. After her son was defeated, she was then sent back to France, and she died in France in bitter exile, really. And she died in 1482. So she didn't even make it to 1485 to see that her arch enemy Cecily was finally brought down. She must have died believing that, in 1482, Edward was hale and hearty and his sons were growing strong. So she must have died thinking that the House of York was going to be there forever. So that must have been particularly bitter for her. And Elizabeth Woodville, of course, she became Queen's mother when her daughter Elizabeth married Henry VII, famously uniting the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster. So you might think that her future was set brightly, but in fact she died relatively early and relatively poor. She died in 1492, 3 years before Cecily died. And she died in Bermondsey Abbey, where she retired to in 1487. So just 2 years into her daughter's queenship, she retired to Bermondsey Abbey. And it's very unclear whether she went there by choice or whether she went there at Henry VII's command. And there's some indication in the history of this that she was in some way involved in or supportive of the Lambert Simnel affair, the first of the two Tudor pretenders, who may or may not have been her grandchildren.
No comment on that, but I'm smiling from ear to
Yeah,
ear. Yeah, very interesting timing.
yeah,
But
isn't it?
and again, if we look at history through the lens of the women, you can say, well, the timing of that, and perhaps some money had been given to this pretender.
Hmm.
Why would she do that against her own daughter?
Yeah, exactly,
Very interesting
exactly.
moment.
Yeah.
So Margaret Beaufort is buried with absolute splendour um, in Westminster Abbey. Let's talk about where is Cecily now. I believe there was a discovery made within her tomb, which may tell us quite a bit about her
Oh,
character.
I think that tells us quite a lot about her character. She was buried in Fotheringay Church. Um, and Fotheringay, during her lifetime, and particularly during her marriage, was one of two major seats, if you like, of Cecily and her husband. One was Ludlow and one was Fotheringay. And they built the church in Fotheringay together, and several of her children are buried there, particularly those who died in childhood. And her husband was buried there eventually, and she chose it as her resting place, and Henry VII gave permission for her to be buried there next to her husband. But her tomb was messed about during the dissolution of the monasteries, when many of the churches were attacked and disfigured, and her tomb ended up being in a bit of a mess. And when Elizabeth I, who of course is Cecily's ancestress, was on the throne, and she visited Fotheringay, she was horrified to see the state of Cecily's tomb and ordered it to be restored. And when that work was being done and Cecily was exhumed for the rebuilding, they found tied around her neck on a scarlet ribbon a papal pardon, tight around her neck. And that just, when I read that, it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, because it just seemed to me that Cecily went to her grave believing that when she stood at heaven's gate, she was going to need a really good get out of jail free card. That there was something that she had done in life that was going to require a pretty powerful pardon. And that really set me thinking about what that might have been.
Gosh, and if there was ever a reason to pick up this book, guys, it's to find out what that thing is. Annie, I always ask my guests this one last question here on Misunderstood. So Cecily has clearly been overlooked, ignored, forgotten, and misunderstood.
Mm.
So if you had 30 seconds to reintroduce Cecily Neville to the world, what would you say?
Mm. I would say that here is a medieval woman, pre-feminist, Catholic, pre-Reformation, royal, dynast, who lived for 80 years through the most tumultuous period of English history and was never far from the absolute pivot of power. And she was not a victim. She was not a saint. She was a woman who was prepared to act. And she was a woman who took power into her own hands and did what was necessary and needful for herself and for her family and for her dynasty. And she was full of courage. Knock Cecily down and she's just going to get up and fight you again. She'll never give up. She'll never give up. And I think that's what we need to know about medieval women. There's this myth that medieval women were powerless and meek, and at best they were the sort of adored ornaments of the court, and at worst they were sort
Mm.
of hopeless victims who, victims of oppression and so on. But that's not true. Neither Cecily nor these other three women were meek. They were very, very active and very, very determined, and they weren't always nice, but they were very determined women. And I think as young women today need to know that there are women that women having power is not a new thing. all through the centuries, there have been powerful women who stood shoulder to shoulder with the men and got things done. And the patriarchy has told us that's not so, and that is not true. So, one in the eye for the patriarchy from Cecily, I think.
Well, we're happy to smash the patriarchy with you any day, Annie. The King's Mother comes out on the 11th of July. It is highly, highly recommended. And you're going on tour. Where can we keep in touch with your adventures? I'm not going to ask you to say where we can go and see you, but where can we find out where we can go and see you?
Yes, there's a lot of events coming up, and some of them are really exciting. And you can find them all on my website, which is anniegarthwaite.com. And they're all listed there, and details are coming in thick and fast. The tour is getting bigger every day. So I'll be up and down the country like a mad thing, but I'm really looking forward to it and really keen to meet people and talk about this book, because having taken so long to write it, I'm really looking forward to the talking bit now.
Thank you so much for talking to me about it, Annie. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been great.
Thanks again to Annie for that brilliant chat. The King's Mother is available now. Do go get yourself a copy. If you've enjoyed listening to this episode, we would love for you to leave us a 5-star review. It really does make a huge difference. You can support us through Patreon, where we're at patreon.com/historyhack. Or if you just want to give us a little tip, go to ko-fi.com, which is ko-fi.com/historyhack. And as a reward for listening all the way to the end, I've got a little bit of a something for you. Now, you know I like to give you a recommendation at the end of my episodes. I love stuff, music, books, films. I'm here for it all. And I wanted to recommend something along the lines of, something female fronted, because this is MsUnderstood. So I wanted to tell you, if you have not heard of them already, you need to be checking out The Last Dinner Party. They are an all-female group and their music is fantastic. They've really taken the charts by storm. They smashed Glastonbury in a way that, oh my goodness, it was a fantastic set, which may still be available on the iPlayer when you're listening. You can check that out. But their album, Prelude to Ecstasy, is fantastic. It's baroque and roll. They are wonderful. They've got a huge following of young women going to listen to them, which is always wonderful to see at gigs. So check out The Last Dinner Party. That is my recommendation. Thanks so much for listening, guys.